Hello, hello, lovely storytellers. Welcome back to the Fiction Author Business School podcast. I'm so glad you're here today. So I'm going to start by asking you a question, as I usually do. I'm wondering if you ever wonder why I harp so much on story planning and outlining and what to do before you start writing and all of the things that I talk about so much. I mean, why am I so for that? And, lots of people out there are pantsers and they write the way they want to write, so why not just leave well enough alone, right? And give everyone their writing process. Well, I'm going to be talking about that today. I'm going to talk about how not using some intentionality in your writing process is probably killing your storytelling, and it's definitely killing your book sales, all right? So we're going to get into that, what it means, what I mean, and why this is so important and why I very much harp on it and try to get you guys to be a little bit more intentional in your story writing and everything to do with your fiction author success, all right? So stay tuned for that. Okay, so I'm going to give you a quote here. Brian Tracy said, "Every minute you spend in planning saves 10 minutes in execution. This gives you a 1,000% return on energy." Think about that for a minute, guys. Every minute you spend in planning saves 10 minutes in execution. So if you even sit down and plan your story for, say, an hour, which is 60 minutes, you've saved 10 times that. It'll take you 10 hours less to write your story because you sat down and planned for 1 hour. And of course, that gives you such a huge, that's an exponential return on energy. So here's the thing. Planning parts of your story, being intentional, is not in any way, shape, or form meant to squash your creativity. And truthfully, it never could. So I want you guys to get away from thinking that planning or outlining or story templates or, trying to write a story just because somebody else writes it that way. I want you to get away from thinking that any of that is bad or that any of it is going to take away your freedom to create the story you want to create. Okay, first of all, there is no way anyone could ever actually do that. Just the fact that you are coming up with stories in your head, you are exercising your own creativity. And I've talked about before on the podcast, so I won't rehash it a whole lot, how constraints actually make us more creative, not less, because it is more of a challenge to be creative within a constraint. And constraints let us know the boundaries, the guardrails of our story in a good way, so that we are creating very cohesive and focused stories rather than just going all over the place with it, right? So there's that too. But it goes even deeper than that, because I want you guys to start thinking about the process for bringing your stories to a reader as having two different parts of an equation. So the first part, the first half of it, is that you have to create the story as the author and put it out there, okay? So imagine yourself, you have a finished product in your hand, a finished book that has been printed, and it's wonderful, and you've done everything to make it amazing, and you are standing on a bridge halfway across, and you are holding that book out and saying, "Here is my story for anyone who wants to read it." Well, the second half of the equation is that the reader has to meet you halfway, has to come and accept your story and connect with it. And that, when that happens, that is the magic of fiction, right? We are writing stories and our readers are reading them and connecting with them. But the reason that I want you to imagine it this way is that you have to understand that you need to help your reader connect with that story. If you are writing your story saying, no, this is my story, it's going to be exactly how I want it, and readers can take it or leave it. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. You can certainly do that, but you're not going to sell as many books that way. If you can, I don't want to say force, you can't force the reader to have an emotional reaction to your story, but At the same time, you need to kind of help facilitate that, right? You need to help them connect with your story. You need to help them, lead them to the emotional reaction you want them to have, and then they will have it. It's very possible to manufacture a very specific emotional reaction that you want your reader to have, and then when they have it, they will fall in love with your story, and they will fall in love with you as the writer. So, intentionality is something that we need to practice in our writing process for a lot of different reasons, okay? I mentioned before that it's killing your storytelling, it's killing your sales, it's also killing your energy to not use intentionality, all right? So let me read this quote one more time that I read a minute ago. Every minute you plan in spending saves 10 minutes in execution. This gives you a 1,000% return on energy. I want you to really think about that, guys. We all know that writing, even though we love it, even though we feel called to do it, can be exhausting. And most of us are doing our writing around day jobs and families and a million other things that we have to do. And I don't want to startle anyone here, but the holiday season is just around the corner. And that's usually an even busier time of year than the rest. So wouldn't it behoove you to plan as much as you can so that you're getting as much efficient writing into every spare moment that you have, so that you're just making the most of your time? And understand, even if you're a hardcore pantser, that's fine. That's wonderful, and I support you 100%. But if you just plan a few things about your story before you begin pantsing, it will really focus your story, okay? It'll help keep you on the rails. And that creates a more focused story to begin with, which means more emotion in your story, better experience for the reader, and therefore better sales. Okay, so if you're not using intentionality, I've talked about this before, what it leads to is an unfocused story. And unfocused stories do not have the sales that very focused, cohesive stories have. Therefore, it is killing your sales, right? But at the same time, it's also going to save you a lot of time and energy. There's that 1,000% return on energy, right? Who doesn't want more time to both be with our families and do other things, but also more time to write? Because it takes time to get our words down on the page. We all know that. And we want to get these stories out to the masses. But if it's taking us 10 years to write every single story, I mean, no judgment, that's fine if that's what you have to work with. But what if you could do it a lot faster and save yourself a lot of trashed words, a lot of headaches, and a lot of rewrites? Isn't that something that you would want? I think there's a major misconception that pantsing, or just not planning your story in general, even if we're not specifically talking about pantsing, that is more creative and will end up producing a better story just because you're following the muse and letting it take you where it will and that sort of thing. It's just this very romantic notion. But I'm here to tell you that that's actually not true. In fact, the opposite is. I understand why people think that way. I mean, a lot of authors think that. It's part of this whole starving artist and the creative muse reveals itself only to a lucky few old wives' tales, right, about fiction writing. But consider for a moment, if you will, James Patterson. He's obviously very well known, widely published, widely read, very wealthy man. He's arguably one of the most successful authors of all time. Another thing we know about James Patterson is he does not write every word of his books. He actually uses ghostwriters to help him. But think about that. I know that most of us aren't doing that, and probably most of us never will. But in order to do that, he is writing outlines, and then he hands them over to ghostwriters who can emulate his style and voice, right? But that takes a lot of planning. If he could not plan his stories, if he did not know what he wanted them to be, he could never do that, right? If he was just pantsing all of his stories out of his own head, and he would not be as successful as he is. Now, again, I know that most of us may not have any desire to do that, and that's fine, but the point is, most really successful authors, not all, I know that there are some exceptions, looking at you, Mr. Stephen King, but by far, most uber successful authors plan at least a good chunk of their story. And that's why they're so successful. That's why their story feels so cohesive. J.K. Rowling famously knew most of Harry Potter before she started writing. She wrote it on a napkin, right, in a cafe. And I am one who doesn't actually think she knew all of it. I think there were a lot of things, if you pay attention, that shifted a little bit along the way as she wrote. But I do think she had most of it. She had the bones of it and the most important items. And then she could fill in the magical little details as she went along. And that, more than anything else, is what I am recommending that you do. I'm not saying you have to plan obsessively, even though I'm something of an obsessive planner. But the more that you can plan, the better. Okay? If you plan at least the bones of your story, and then even if you're pantsing most of it, it will still feel really cohesive because you've planned the most important parts of it and you're writing toward a specific outcome and toward a specific theme, right? Even if you have to make changes, like say you do all of that and the objection is usually, well, yeah, but what if I do all that and then halfway through I have this inspiration moment and I have to change it all anyway? Okay, well, that might happen. I'm not saying it won't. But if you have already planned everything and are writing toward a specific theme and a specific outcome, the changes won't be as big and they won't take as much time to implement. So either way, you're still saving yourself a lot of time and energy. But let's go back to the sales portion of it, right? How is lack of intentionality killing your sales? Well, I did already kind of cover this, but it comes back to the focus story. And really, the sales and the storytelling, I said it's killing your storytelling, they really do go hand in hand. If you don't plan anything and you're just writing willy-nilly, you end up with an unfocused story. So that affects your storytelling. It's just not as good. I'm sorry, it's just not. And you're going to have less emotion in the story, which means less connection with readers, and therefore, fewer sales. And I reiterate my James Patterson example here as well. One of the most successful authors in the world who makes tons of money and is one of very few, he might even be the only one who was ever studied by Harvard Business College. He is a hardcore planner. Just think about that. Even if you are not doing what he is doing, even if you are not planning to the extent to which he is planning, success is usually about planning. And I would even go so far as to say, and I've said this before, Stephen King is a well-known pantser, and okay, not arguing with that, but Stephen King is a master storyteller, and I really do believe that he kind of mentally pantses it, or I guess I should say mentally plans it, but physically pantses it. So I think he's keeping a lot of it in his head. And yes, I know that he famously a lot of times doesn't know what the ending of his stories are going to be, but because he is such a masterful storyteller, he ends up coming up with an ending organically that matches what he's already written. And that makes it a cohesive story. Now, if you can get to the point where you can do that, then more power to you. But most people can't do that. And most people, when they're starting out, need to plan more just so that they can really ingrain story structure and the feel of a really cohesive story into themselves, into their brains, into their emotions. And then after that, once you have a few stories under your belt, you really will start to do it naturally. And that's the point, is we need to really teach ourselves how to write a great story, even if we're pantsing it. But most people, when they start out pantsing, they're just all over the place, and that's not actually what's happening. So it's kind of like what they always say about how in order to break the rules gracefully, you have to learn the rules first, right? That's kind of what we're after. So one question you might be asking is, what kinds of things should you plan before you start writing? I've got 3 that are definite, and 4 is the 4th one that's kind of a bonus. Number 1, your character's wound and backstory. Why? Because your character's wound and backstory inform all of their beliefs and the way they react to the world and the way, like the lens through which they see the world, which means everything your character does and says and how they react in every situation is predicated on that character wound and the beliefs that arose from it. Okay, so that's very, very important that you understand that about your character. The second thing you need to plan is the end of your story, both the climactic moment, which is what's happening physically in the plot, and the character transformation, which is the internal arc. And again, that's just because you need to know where you're headed with the story. If you don't know where you're headed, that's how you go off the rails, because you're not aiming at something. Think of it like, aiming something to do with marksmanship, a bow and arrow, a BB gun, a slingshot, what have you. If you're not aiming and you're just like flipping it around everywhere, or, pointing the end of it up, down, left, right, you're never going to hit anything, right? You have to be able to point it at a particular location and skillfully home in on that location. Same thing with the story. You need to know where you're going with it. Otherwise, it just feels very disjointed, okay? Not to mention, if you know where you're going with it, this is actually a conversation I had with a friend of mine who's an author. It's always possible that when you get to the end, you can go back through, when you run through your manuscript again after you've written the first draft, and put in themes and symbolism and foreshadow and all of that. And I actually don't have a problem with that. I think that it's better if you plan it before. But there's also, because one of the things that I very much do pants, everybody pantses somewhat, right? Including me, who is a hardcore outliner. And one of the things I very much do pants are little mini themes. Okay, it's not the overarching story theme that I'm always harping about, but little mini themes that tend to come out in the dialogue when I'm writing my scenes, or in the internal dialogue sometimes. And then I will go back if I think that's a really cool theme and sort of sprinkle it throughout the manuscript. So I'm not against doing that. But if you plan in advance well enough and you know where you're headed, you can actually sprinkle in foreshadowing as you go, because you already know where your character is going to end up, right? And that, again, saves you a lot of time, because you're doing it beforehand and not having to go back again and again and again and do all these passes through your manuscript to get all the details in. Okay, so again, it's just a time saver. The more that you know going in, the more you can do the first time through, and the less you will have to go back and do again and again. Okay. The third thing that I do want you to plan is your overarching story theme. Not the little mini themes I was just talking about, but the overarching one. That is very, very tied up in your climactic moment and in the end of the story. So if you plan, let's just put it this way, if you're planning the character wound and you're planning the character backstory and you're planning the ending, you probably already have the theme, you just need to state it, right? But it's kind of the same thing as writing with an ending in mind. You are writing toward a particular theme. Think of it this way. And I guess this pulls in mood as well as theme, but if your theme is pretty happy, like say you're writing a romantic comedy or, even something like Pride and Prejudice, and for the most part it is pretty lighthearted and your theme is lighthearted, then that is the way your story is going to feel, because you're writing it with that theme in mind, and naturally you're just going to write it that way. On the other hand, if your theme is very dark and you're writing a very dark story, then you're naturally going to infuse that into the way you write your chapters and your scenes, and your book is going to feel very dark. Are you starting to see with why it's a problem if you have no idea what your theme is and no idea where you're going with your story? It's going to feel very different depending on what that is. And if you don't know, then parts of it may be written very happy and very sunny, and other parts may be written very darkly, and then it feels like a disjointed story. So you definitely need to plan those three things and be intentional with them. And guys, just doing that alone will save you so much time, and as the quote says, so much energy, and it'll just make things so much easier. The fourth kind of optional thing is I would really prefer that you took a stab at basic story structure, okay? Understanding the basics of the way that a plot works, even if it's just, beginning, inciting incident, keep ratcheting up the tension until the climactic moment. I mean, I think most of us understand the basic story structure like that, but the better that you can understand it, the more you will naturally adhere to it. And I'm not going to go into this now because I talk about it all the time, but the basic structure of story is the basic structure of the human journey. And so if you adhere to that, not only do you create emotion naturally, not only does it just make for a better and more cohesive story, but your readers will automatically connect with it. So back to that image at the beginning of you standing on a bridge holding out your book, if you help your reader connect with the story, it's like closing the gap between you guys, right? If you just say, this is my story, it's exactly what I want, and I don't care what anybody thinks, and I don't care if the reader connects with it, if it's meant to be, they'll connect with my story or something like that. It's really more like standing on opposite sides of the bridge, or maybe even standing on opposite sides of the river, right? And what are you going to chuck your story and hope they catch it? You know what I mean? That's pretty much what you're doing. But if you can use some intentionality to help them connect emotionally with your story, it's pretty much like walking across the bridge, putting it in their hands, and then they have it. They can automatically connect with it. So that's what I want you to try and do. Quick recap. Intentionality will save you a lot of time in the execution of your story. It will save you a lot of energy so that you're not so burnt out and tired and don't have such a hard time, putting effort into your writing. And that is only going to help you write more effectively, produce more books, sell more books, and get more genuine satisfaction out of your writing, okay? Every minute you spend in the planning saves 10 minutes in execution, and this gives you a 1,000% return on energy. Again, it was Tracy that said that. So at the very least, the more planning you can do, the better, in my personal opinion. But at the very least, if you're not much of a planner, I want you to plan the character's wound and backstory, which will give rise to their limiting belief. I want you to plan the end of the story, which is both the climactic moment physically, like in the plot, and also the internal arc. And then I want you to plan the overarching theme of your story so that you are writing to the correct theme. And that way your story will feel very cohesive. And if you can, at least take a stab at story structure so that you are not, again, just waltzing off the rails and then you have to come back and fix it all. Okay? All right, guys. Well, once again, if you want more help with this, if you need more help with this, consider coming to join us in the legendary Fiction Forge. This is what I teach. I teach what to plan, how to plan it, what questions to ask, exactly how to do this pertaining to your story and your characters. I teach you to eventually be able to position every single story you write as a bestseller because you are infusing it with enough emotion to help readers automatically connect with it. And then I teach you to take that emotion and also use it in your marketing. All right. So if that is something that you think would serve you at all, go to bit.ly/Fiction Forge, which I will also put in the show notes, and join us there. We are actually getting ready to head into a month focused on writing villains, which is one of my favorite topics. So I'm really excited about that. So now if you are having any trouble getting your villain figured out, this is the time to join because I will have a lot of trainings in there about villains, okay? But that is all I have for you today. I will see you next time. Everyone have a wonderful week of writing. Make sure to practice some intentionality as much as you can. And yeah, I will catch you in the next episode. Have a wonderful week, guys. Bye.